It's my pleasure to chair this panel on disparities. As I've told some of my co-panelists, in no way am I a China expert. My own work in China has been confined to public health, primarily from the standpoint of changing economic and social conditions, social circumstance in China that put people at new levels of risk for different diseases and injury. And of course, disparity plays out very importantly in that process, so that people who fall on the short end of the new resources are at very special risk. The panel today is going to be addressing economic, social disparities. I would also point to, although I don't know that we have specific remarks, I would also point to the growing, what's referred to as environmental injustice, such that people who are at the poorer end of the socioeconomic spectrum tend to end up in the least healthy environments, the most polluted environments, with the poorest air quality, water quality, and so forth, which puts people at, these people at excess risk for a number of health outcomes. This last week, we had a group of people here for another symposium focusing on the changing disease trends in South and East Asia, India, China, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Thailand. And I was struck by a presentation by Li Ming, who was the founding director of the China CDC, when he pointed to the re-emergence now, and certainly in large measure as a result of the changing economic conditions, the re-emergence of old diseases that had pretty much been eradicated in China. Sexually transmitted diseases would be first among those. Re-emergence of tuberculosis at a level that is alarming. Then, of course, the newly emerging diseases, HIV, relatively new, and most recently SARS and avian flu and these other potentially devastating infectious diseases. In all of this, however, it gets lost that, in fact, with China's economic prosperity, economic development, China has begun to look very much like the US and the EU, the European Union, in regards to what really kills people prematurely. It's not so much infectious diseases anymore, it's diseases of the lifestyle and circumstances, heart disease, cancer, as people are now more affluent. And this plays out especially strongly, for reasons that are unknown, for those people who are still living under marginal economic conditions. So that these people seem to accelerate very rapidly their risk for these chronic diseases. So this is the area of my own research. I'll give you that just as background. This panel will not focus specifically on health disparities, but I think everything that's said here is will be said here is very relevant to the health dimensions of disparity. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and moving from this side across. Our first speaker is Cindy Fan. She is professor of geography at UCLA and professor and chair of the Department of Asian American Studies. Her research interests center on regional and social dimensions of transitional economies, focusing specifically on labor migration, gender and migration, regional policy and inequality, and the urban system in China. She has published more than 50 refereed articles in leading disciplinary journals. Her book, and as I understand it, her presentation today is drawn from her new book, is entitled China on the Move, Migration, the State, and the Household, and it'll be published by Routledge in late 2007. Our next speaker is Xiaoguang Wang. Xiaoguang Wang is professor of political science at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and chief editor of the China Review. He has authored and co-authored and edited some 20 books in both English and Chinese. His research interests include political economy, comparative politics, physical politics, democratization, and economic and political development in former socialist countries and East Asian countries. And the discussant today is Andrew Walder. Andrew Walder is professor of sociology and senior fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. He's an expert on the sources of conflict, stability, and change in communist regimes, and his current research focuses on the impact of China's market reforms on income inequality and career opportunity. We'll start the presentations with Professor Wang, and the title of her talk will be Migration, Hoku, and the Chinese City. Professor Wang.
Thank you, Andy. I was just looking at what is being served as refreshment, and there's chips. Something about degenerative diseases that we need to be thinking about.
They didn't ask me.
It's a privilege to be on this panel, and as Andy just mentioned, I'm from UCLA, and when I told my colleagues that I'm going to be presenting a paper at USC, and they started to frown, and I said, well, I'm a spy there. I wanted to know what they have done to make it so successful, this US-China Institute. But I'm actually a secret admirer. So don't tell my colleagues at UCLA, but I am an admirer. But maybe, Clay, am I being videotaped? Okay, my talk is Migration, Hukou, and the Chinese City. And I wanted to start by saying that the statistics about urbanization shows that China has been urbanizing rather rapidly over the last several decades, from about 21% in 1982 to the estimate for 2015 is going to be more than 50%. Now, it took the United States about 80 years for its level of urbanization to increase from about 20% to 50%. So in that regard, this is a rather rapid increase. And of course, migration, rural-urban migration, has been a big part of that increase. There have been a lot of different types of terms to describe the increased migration in China over the last several decades. Waves of human tide, describing again the volume. Blind flows, this is really not that accurate. What this term is trying to portray is that migration has been disorderly, chaotic, and so on. It's really actually not the case. Floating population, this really has to do with the household registration system, the Hukou system. So a lot of the rural-urban migrants are denied permanent residence in the city. Undocumented migrants, this is really a Western term, but basically talking about the same thing. And peasant apartheid, this is referring to the fact that peasant migrants are treated like second-class citizens. There's a big divide between the countryside and the city. Floating population, this is actually a stock measure, meaning that we're just counting the number of people, okay, regardless of number of migrants, regardless of when they came. And then, so individuals that are not living at their place of registration, that's what it means. So counting everybody that are not living at their place of registration, the estimate for 2005 was 150 million. Now, what does that mean? For the world as a whole, the volume of international migration is less than 200 million, okay? So 150 million people in China is constantly on the move. Now, those figures were actually counting also including intra-county migrants. If we just look at the inter-county migration, the purple columns refer to the floating population. The yellow columns, the yellow bars, they are actually a different kind of measure. They're measuring migration between one point in time and 5 years later. But nonetheless, regardless of which measure you're using, the increase between 1990, in this case 1990 census, and 2000 census was big. But let's break down the yellow columns, the yellow bars, into the proportion of interprovincial and proportion of intra-provincial. And of course, interprovincial is of longer distance. So in the year 2000, according to the 2000 census, interprovincial migrants accounted for 41% of all inter-county migration, and that's been an increase from 33% in 1990. What it means is that migrants are moving longer distances. Okay, I'm going to show two maps. This is from the 1990 census. The coastal areas, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, has been most attractive. Using the same scale, that's the map for 2000, right? Again, coastal areas have been most attractive, but the arrows are much bigger, thicker, and Guangdong in the southeastern part of China has been the big magnet of migrants. In fact, in the 2000 census, Guangdong accounted for 36% of all interprovincial migrants. Also, between 1990 and 2000, the level of concentration, the spatial concentration, has increased. If we break down the volume of migrants into so-called permanent migrants and temporary migrants, I won't go into all the controversy about these definitions, but the temporary migrants basically refer to those that move without change of their registration. Okay. So in the year 2000, temporary migrants accounted for almost three quarters of all migrants. And in fact, between 1990 and 2000, the volume of permanent migrants, indicated by the green zone, green areas, had actually declined. So much of what has happened was due to rural-urban labor migrants, basically. And I'm going to skip this graph, and I'm going to go to this one. This one shows temporary migrants, the reason of migration, and I won't go through all the definition of the terms, but industry/business, this basically refers to labor migration. So in the year 1990, about 50% of the temporary migrants moved because of labor reason, to find work in the city, basically. And that reason was even more dominant in the year 2000. So in the Chinese terminology, the Chinese term is 打工, meaning going to the city to find work. There's plenty of evidence of exploitation, harassment, discrimination, segregation, social exclusion that these migrants have experienced, as also very eloquently documented and discussed in Doris Sollinger's 1999 book. And this is a story reported in LA Times, also in other papers in the West, also newspapers in China, that I think late 2003, early 2004, Premier Wen Jiabao had to intervene in order for a Sichuan migrant to get back a year's worth of back wages. And this is widely reported. Okay. So I think a very interesting question is what account for, despite all these inferior conditions that the migrants are experiencing, what account for the large size of the temporary migration and also their inferior situations? The obvious answer is inequality. Here are just some of the figures to show that the overall inequality in China has increased, as indicated by the Gini coefficient. Shanghai, the leading province in terms of GDP per capita, Guizhou, the bottom, the gap between them had increased. The gap between the rural and urban areas in terms of income has also increased over time. In addition to this line of explanation, however, there are two prevailing explanations that exist. One I call hukou paradigm, and the other I call permanent settlement paradigm. The hukou paradigm basically focuses on how this dualistic structure dividing China into urban and rural has perpetuated inequality, has defined migrants as outsiders, etc., etc. And there are a lot of evidence for that. This is a picture of a migrant children's school in Beijing. According to a report published in 2004, there were almost 300 migrant children's schools in Beijing outside of the sort of official education system. And a lot of these schools are substandard and so on. The policy implication of this line of argument, the hukou paradigm, is that removal of hukou is going to resolve the problem. Again, this backdrop, a series of hukou reforms have been implemented, and this is just a sample of the changes that have taken place. Despite these reforms, hukou is still important. And this is an example from the China Daily, reporting that students with a Beijing hukou only, it's still a requirement in this year's recruitment tests for civil servants at some central government agencies and agencies in the Beijing municipality. Okay. In the most recently concluded National People's Congress, Premier Wen read the government report and includes also a statement about what the government could do to help the migrants. We will accelerate the establishment of a social safety net targeted at rural migrant workers in cities with a focus on signing them up for workers' compensation insurance and medical insurance for major diseases. So the government is paying attention. While it is certain that hukou is a primary reason for the positions of primary migrants, I argue that an approach that emphasizes hukou alone has the risk of privileging structural, institutional, and top-down explanations over bottom-up, household, and individual levels perspectives. And I'll return to that in a couple of minutes. The second paradigm that I like to question is the permanent settlement paradigm. And what this paradigm is trying to describe or trying to emphasize is that temporary migrants eventually want to stay and that they desire to stay. And if you think about post-war Europe, the guest worker program and so on, many of these temporary migrants did end up staying. And thus this often repeated phrase that there is nothing so permanent as a temporary migrant. However, more recently, for example, scholars like Graham Hugo has been arguing that non-permanent and circular migration actually has increased rapidly, and also that migrants are obtaining the best of both worlds by earning in high-income countries and living in low-cost origins, and one way that they can do this is to keep their family at the origin. So the two questions that I like to pose is, do peasant migrants in China really want to settle in the city, and is migrant work a long-term or short-term strategy? So far, the evidence has been rather mixed, and it is extremely difficult, actually, to come up with systematic evidence to answer these questions. But we do have more than 2 decades of experience in terms of migration since the reforms. And I think that there is evidence to question the hukou paradigm and the permanent resident paradigm, or at least to argue that these paradigms are inadequate. So in the following several minutes, I'm just going to show some preliminary evidence, a lot of these probably quite anecdotal, to try to support this position. The household strategy approach actually has been quite popular in the international migration literature. And I wanted to argue that a split household strategy is very popular, is commonly pursued by migrants in China, and the most popular model is one where the husband does migrant work, the wife stays home. And so there's certainly a gender division of labor dimension there. But there are other models, there are other ways, intergenerational and multi-household division of labor, and I'll talk about remittances also. So in many villages in China, there are only married women, the elderly, and the children remain. Now this is an example of a multi-household division of labor, and I'm gonna read it. This is a man who decided to return, a migrant worker who decided to return to the village, and this is the reason. The reason of my return is that my parents are getting old and sick and need help. I discussed with my two brothers and decided that we would take turns to come back for 2 years to take care of them. Since I am the oldest son, I am the first to return. So there's definitely a collective strategy here that spans across different households and also negotiated. How remittances are used, according to the studies that we have, actually there's this high level of consistency in terms of how remittances are being used. They're being used for living expenses, building house, agriculture input, and other kinds of consumption. And so these uses really, I think, are evidence to show that there's a strong desire to sustain rural livelihood. It's actually a desire to return to a comfortable kind of living in the countryside. So this is a picture of a village in which you see some of the older houses in the front, and then some of the newer houses at the back. And the newer houses are the ones that were built because of remittances. This is an example of a new house because of remittances. Okay, bear with me. This is a long quote, but I think this is a very illustrative quote of how migrants can actually obtain the best of both worlds by circulating between the city and the countryside. So this is a veteran migrant worker who's been doing migrant work for more than 10 years. He said, comparing urban and rural people, assuming a 4-person household in the city, and if there's one or more laid off or shagang workers in the family, then the financial burden is very heavy. For a 4-person household in the countryside, assuming one person is doing migrant work, even if the work is not profitable, there's still the land and a house to support the wife and children. Take our family as an example. Our expenses are much lower than urban families. Similar to workers in the city, I make several hundred yuan a month, but I have much more freedom and probably better quality of life than they. And there's also the identity dimension. This is actually a father of a migrant worker who said, he referring to the son, he is a peasant after all. Peasants who live and work in the city can be considered half urban and half rural, but fundamentally they are still peasants. Eventually they will return to the village. So I'm arguing that circular migration is really the strategy that's being used. Migrants come back for the Spring Festival or the Chinese New Year during planting and harvesting to help out with agriculture. And I promise this is my last quote. The wild goose household, this term has been used in the Chinese literature to refer to the frequency of movement. Okay. So this construction worker tells a story about what had happened over the last 10 years for him. I began migrant work in 1983. After getting married in 1984, I stayed home to farm for 2 years. In 1987, I worked in a coal mine. Then between 1988 and 1990, I stayed home to farm and build a house. I began migrant work again in 1991. Every year, I returned home before the Spring Festival and helped with planting before going out again. In 2004, I stayed home to farm. My wife went out that year. So here we have a lot of changes. We have this migrant worker changing work, changing destination, returning, going out again, another household member, his wife going out again. So multiple and a series of decisions. And I think this example helps the argument that conventional definitions of migration and return migration are inadequate because they assume a large degree of permanency. I argue that it is the circularity, not migration, that is permanent. So let me conclude by saying that, again, recapping. The hukou is an important explanation, but not the sole explanation of temporary migration. That permanent settlement assumption is questionable because migrants may not desire to stay in a destination, and that a split household strategy allows migrants to obtain the best of both worlds, and circular migration and circulation of labor may very well become the norm and not the exception. Thank you.